Yes. So this is the second portion of our teaching series. The purpose of our first teaching was to share knowledge on the problematic and intrusive history of YPD, and help facilitate the ongoing conversation about what police abolition and what our communities look like with less policing. And so we also want to thank everyone who attended our first teaching and contributed to that beautiful space of learning and growth. We understand the power that knowledge has and wisdom has and historical understanding has in being able to speak truth to power. And so that's why at the end of the day, if you have stuff in your head, you have knowledge you're not looking to share with other people, then that's no different than the wealth hoarding that's going on right now and that we're trying to fight against. Everything we have, we want to impart on other people. And it's the same way we want to keep learning from others as well. So thank you all for being here. Today, we're excited to continue this series with a discussion on Yale's hand in the economic hardships of New Haven and its impact on the criminalization of poverty due to things like segregated development and divestment from New Haven. And in doing that, we also want to look toward a more community-minded future by focusing on differential response systems and participatory budgeting, and the role Yale can play financially in bringing about these safer and more holistic forms of ensuring public safety. Even during the last teach-in, there were people who had questions. And so if you have questions at any point, you can type them in the chat. One of us can answer, but also if you're here and you have knowledge on these things and you want to answer it, you can as well. It was a beautiful thing that we saw last time. We saw a whole bunch of people answering and having conversation throughout the teaching through the chat. So we definitely encourage people to have that happen now. Like Jalen said, we're all in community. So real quick, we are very, very fortunate to have with us three phenomenal speakers. We have Ward 9 Alder and member of Local 33, Charles Decker, who's going to be talking about Yale's history in the economic hardships of New Haven and their role in looking at the landscape of New Haven. Then we have Free Shroth Dalma from the Yale Endowment Coalition, who is going to be talking about Yale's endowment, wealth hoarding, and choice to do much less for the city of New Haven economically, that it both can and should, as well as a community-minded concept of participatory budgeting. And at the end, we are very fortunate to have with us Ala Ochumare from Black Lives Matter New Haven, who will be speaking on the social emotional impact of Yale's self-preservative disposition that it has on New Haven community members, and how looking at things like differential response and participatory budgeting and doing what it can to move its money from a police department towards genuine ways of creating community will actually be more than just a monetary thing, but an emotional and social change. And then finally, our teaching will close with a breakout room session led by a couple local organizations that do phenomenal work to be able to truly show where can these funds go so that we can actually have the change that we need in our communities. And so we're lucky to have with us Mothers and Others for Justice, One Village Healing, and Loaves and Fishes, which are three phenomenal organizations, and we're very fortunate to have them with us and have them lead breakout rooms. And so we thank you all so much for being here, and we hope that this time together is fruitful and powerful, and it leaves you all with a great start to your weekend. And so with that, I will swing it over to Charles Decker.
Thanks, thanks Isaac, and thanks everyone so much for being here for this really exciting project and this exciting teach-in. So as Isaac said, my name is Charles Decker. I am the alder for the 9th Ward here in New Haven, which my ward encompasses part of East Rock and part of Fairhaven. So just in my own ward, I see sort of the two sides, economically speaking, of New Haven. East Rock, where folks are mostly white, mostly fairly well off. A lot of people are Yale affiliated or affiliated with the hospital. And then also Fairhaven, where folks are much more likely to be working class, where unemployment is much higher, where poverty is much higher, where violent crime is much higher, and now where instances and deaths from COVID are much higher. So I'm just going to very briefly walk through a little bit of the history of the situation with Yale economically in New Haven. I'm also I used to be a graduate teacher in the political science department at Yale. I now work for Unite Here and for Unite Here Local 33, which is the campaign for a union for graduate workers here at Yale. And ever since our predecessor organization, which was called GSO, got started in the early 1990s, a really key sort of component of what we've done as a union movement is research. We're a union of researchers, so it kind of makes sense. But we, Yale, of course, wants to hold like their whole financial operation as separate from their academic mission, right? And we have always said, well, that's BS. You can't hold them separate. They're not two different things. The two are just inexorably linked. And so our union for decades now has done research into the endowment and into Yale's spending practices to try to shed light on what they're doing, since they're not being transparent about it themselves. So with that, I guess someone's controlling the slide deck. Could we have the first slide? I don't think I have a control of that. Awesome. Okay. I'm not a big fan of saying next slide, but I will. So just from way back, ever since the founding of Yale, as I think folks here likely know, there's a lot of money from the slave trade that is foundational to Yale University. So Local 33, in conjunction with the Yale Respect New Haven campaign, which folks might know about, we released last week these three graphics, which I'm about to show you, which basically show the amount of property taxes that Yale doesn't pay to New Haven for every building, or every college rather, residential college named after a slave owner. So it's like a little mini campaign from Yale Respect New Haven. We live with these names. We have to live with these names. Why do we have to pay for them? So JE gets a tax break of $1.8 million basically from the city. Next slide. Davenport, over almost 4.5 million. And next slide. And Silliman being the third, another 1.8 million. So this is just a way to show that, this sort of economic injustice and frankly violence, is baked into the institution from the start. Next slide, please. So moving forward a few centuries, and this is something that folks may have seen if you've been to any of the New Haven Rising community presentations. So Local 33 is coalition partners with the other local unions at Yale, and also New Haven Rising, which is the community organizing group, which has been fighting for good jobs in New Haven for the past 7 or 8 years. So this is really important to understand. So I think folks here likely are vaguely familiar, at least with the concept of redlining, but this was basically a system by which the banks in Connecticut designated which neighborhoods in New Haven were desirable to live in. So the red zones in there are the neighborhoods that the banks decided basically were hazardous. It had the practical effect of making it very, very, very difficult for people of color and working people to secure bank loans, so to buy homes. And of course, that creates a situation where it's almost impossible for folks of color in New Haven to build wealth, to build intergenerational wealth, or even just wealth for themselves. So as I go through the next few slides, just sort of keep this picture in your mind. You'll see that the declining and hazardous zones largely form a ring which correspond to Dwight, New Hallville, The Hill, Fairhaven. Next slide. And you see, now we're moving forward about 30 years to the 1960s, where there were still, some good manufacturing jobs in New Haven in the 60s, but you see still that the pattern of unemployment matches up pretty good with that redlining map. Folks in East Rock and the Cove and Westville, basically are at work, and they're likelier to have, good high-paying jobs, good benefits, whereas the people in the communities of color, what we call the neighborhoods of need in New Haven Rising, and on the Board of Alders are already struggling with just tremendously high unemployment in some cases. Next slide, please. Now we come to 2010, where the numbers are a bit different. The unemployment situation overall is higher, and the underemployment situation, which is not on this map, is even higher still. But you see that the pattern is still essentially the same, right? That you can tell really well which are going to be the highest areas of unemployment in New Haven based on which neighborhoods were redlined in the 1930s. You know, again, it's the Hill. So the Hill, if folks don't know, it's the really big red one down towards the bottom. Looks kind of like Louisiana tilted on its side, I guess. But you know, that is a neighborhood that is almost entirely Black and Latinx, and it is you know, it's a community that has been struggling with high unemployment, really high unemployment, especially youth unemployment, for generations now. And tragically, in the past few weeks, you know, it has been also plagued with a rash of shootings and violent crime, which, you know, as we all know, the cause of that, you know, has nothing to do with there not being enough cops on the street. It has to do with people not having jobs and like not knowing how they're going to survive in a global health emergency. Next slide. So this just again shows sort of what the neighborhoods of need are, and that graphic comes from. This is not what I'm going to go into mostly in my presentation, but folks probably know a little bit about the local hiring agreement that Yale and the community through New Haven Rising agreed to a couple years back. But the agreement was that Yale would hire 1,000 New Haven residents into full-time permanent jobs, you know, and they're Yale jobs, so they have very high wages, good benefits. So 1,000 New Haven residents, but 500 of them had to come from these neighborhoods of need, which is a tremendous win for the community. It is not nearly enough, obviously, we all know that, but it was a big win. But I just, you know, again, to visualize what those neighborhoods are, because, next slide, again, just another set of things that the original redlining map predict. So this one is foreclosures initiated, and I'm going to come back to foreclosures for just a second at the very end of my presentation. Next slide. Asthma rates, again, exact same pattern. You know, we know that the cause of asthma, or a cause of asthma, is, you know, environmental racism, to put it bluntly. Next slide. Life expectancy, a different health outcome. Next. And now, you know, we all could have predicted this, but the places in New Haven where there are already crises around employment, around violence, also are now having like the real impact of this public health emergency foisted on them, right? So people of color in New Haven who live in these neighborhoods of need are much likelier than white folks to be infected, to contract COVID-19. They're much likelier, when they do contract it, to die or to get seriously ill or debilitated. And again, just the pattern is the same as all the other patterns, and basically all those graphics we just looked at are predicted by the racist redlining policy of the 1930s. Next slide. So I'm going to go through this very quickly because I know that Fee has a lot of really good stuff to say about the endowment and about Yale's spending. But it is a thing that, you know, Local 33 has been doing research on, like I said, for a very long time. So this graphic right here is an image of the original charter between Yale University and the colony, because Yale predates the United States, so they chartered with the colony. This is where their mega tax exemption comes from. So this may be old territory for y'all, but you know, Yale does pay property tax on its purely commercial properties. So like they own the shops down on Broadway. So because those are purely commercial, they pay property tax on those. They don't pay property tax on any of their academic buildings or any buildings that they make the argument are sort of central to their academic mission, which, you know, it's funny because they don't pay tax on the police station, like property tax at all. The police station is property tax exempt. So, you know, the question that raises for me is, well, what the hell does, you know, the Yale police station, which is a new, big, fancy, extremely expensive building that this city could be like collecting property tax on, what does that have to do with Yale's core academic mission? Next slide. So again, if you've been to a New Haven Rising meeting, there's like a 30-minute version of what I'm running through, just really in 3 minutes. But what this shows is basically, since the middle of the last decade, or it's 2020, so I guess the decade before last, technically. Haha, I'm old. The value of Yale's land, as well as the hospital's land, has been rising extremely quickly. This is mostly because property values themselves are rising. This doesn't, for the most part, represent them buying up a bunch of new land, although they certainly are doing that. But all the land they own in New Haven, which is a tremendous amount, is paying off as a great investment for them, since it's not paying taxes on it. Next slide. So New Haven, the city, does get some money by virtue of Yale's presence there. So there's two different sources. One is that Yale gives a voluntary contribution each year to the city. I, on the board of alders, get the letter in my email once a year saying, "Good news, New Haven, we're re-upping our voluntary contribution, so we should be grateful for that." It runs in the, I forget the exact figure this past year. I think it was 14 million, but it's in that range. It's in the in the tens of millions of dollars. And on top of that, the state reimburses the city a little bit for all the property, the tax-exempt property that Yale and the hospital. It's called the pilot program, payment in lieu of taxes. I think that pilot is not, even if pilot worked, which it doesn't, and I'll say why in a minute. But even if it worked, it's still public money going to top up what Yale could or should be contributing to the city. The pilot comes from the state, but at the end of the day, it's still public taxpayer money, just from a different source. But the state doesn't really want to give that much money. So as you can see clearly from this graph, the combination of the pilot funding and also the voluntary contribution has been flat. It's too low to begin with, but it has stayed flat while the total property value of Yale is rising extremely quickly. And so these values are getting more and more and more disparate. And so last year, New Haven Rising and Local 33 and Local 34 researchers calculated the value of this sort of missing tax revenue from Yale and the hospital combined at $146 million. As opposed to the about $50 million that we get combined from the voluntary contributions from Yale and the hospital and the pilot payment from the state. Last and final slide for my portion, please. So this just shows how that compares to things at the city. I'm on the finance committee of the board of alders, so I deal with the budget every year. And this just compares to some of the things that the city spends money on. So I hear all the time from my constituents that the reason why New Haven's broke is because, pensions are out of control. We're just paying those city workers way too much money and way too much pensions. But if you look at employee benefits and if you look at pensions, and if you combined those two, it would add up to roughly the Yale tax break. I mean, a little bit more, but roughly that much. It is much bigger than even the fairly large public safety budget. It's almost as big as the entire Board of Ed budget. The schools here obviously are chronically underfunded. So that's my last slide. Before I turn it over to Fee, just the last thing I'll say is, and she will talk about this, but it is worth it's worth thinking about throughout all this where exactly some of Yale's investment money comes from, such that they were able to buy all of this property in the first place. And one instance that I really just makes my blood boil is you saw the map a few slides ago of all the instances of foreclosures initiated from 2008 to 2012 and how that mapped up really well with the redlining map in the neighborhoods of need. Our research department discovered a few years ago, and we got an article in Bloomberg, of all places, about this, that Yale had major investments into two mortgage servicing companies that initiate foreclosure, or they don't initiate them, but they process foreclosures technically. it's worth looking up. I can maybe send it to the organizers of this event to circulate this article, because like I said, it really makes my blood boil, especially because one of the things that Yale really loves to promote that they do in the city is this thing called the new homeowner buyers program or something like that. Basically, they give some of their employees favorable loans and I think grants in order to buy their first homes. And this article in Bloomberg was about one of their employees who, bought his house through his good Yale job and through the home buyers program, and then was like in foreclosure proceedings that were being serviced by the very company that Yale invested millions and millions of dollars in. So it's like Yale both sort of like, contributed to this working class Black worker being able to afford a home, but then also, after the financial crash was profiting off of the banks trying to take it away, essentially. So with that, thank you, and I will turn it over.
Thank you, Charles. Hi, everyone. My name's Fee, she, her, and I'm from the Endowment Justice Coalition, which is an organization that advocates for the movement of Yale's capital away from oppressive and extractive institutions and toward recovery and community power. Now, Charles just gave us a really excellent breakdown of why Yale is ethically obligated to redistribute its wealth. And that could mean moving the Yale Police Department's money into the communities most affected by the YPD's violence. But what if you feel like redistribution is just not practical? Maybe you've heard this and you're thinking that Yale needs its wealth to keep funding research or to pay its staff or to save in preparation for the impending economic recession. If any of this is on your mind, we've got answers. And it involves a history lesson, a bit of math, and ultimately some hope. I think with such a beautiful and powerful group of people here today, we can all emerge with an understanding of why and how Yale has the practical means to pay up. So first, to ground us in how Yale's wealth relates to police abolition, I want you to join me in taking a moment to think about your definition of the word crime. What did you think crime meant when you first learned of the concept in childhood? What did you think it meant 5 years ago? What do you think it means now? You can even type in the chat an action that could be considered a crime by the laws of the settler state or by you and your community, by anyone. Go ahead. Jalen says driving while black. Sleeping on a park bench. Robbery. Missing rent payments. Murder. Thanks for these reflections. Keep musing, and let's hold these thoughts in our minds as I walk us through the acts Yale University has committed to obtain its wealth and the so-called crimes that it uses its wealth to punish with policing. We have traced wealth inequity in what we call New Haven back to redlining and segregation. And if we go further back to enslavement and the settler colonial project, we will find Yale at the source. The university's founding coincided with New Haven's beginnings as a colony, when a group of 10 white settlers and enslavers presented donations for the establishment of a college. That's all an endowment is, a donation of capital intended for a fixed purpose. And in this case, it was capital made off of stolen land and traded people. From the start, the growth of Yale's endowment was predicated on racial capitalism. Its first trustees held enslaved Black people, its first scholarships were funded by a plantation in Rhode Island, and Elihu Yale and other major benefactors made their fortunes off of international colonizing forces like the British East India Company. In fact, Yale himself was president of a British East India Company post in Madras, where he sold hundreds of human lives to Atlantic colonies. None of these actions were considered a crime by the US government. That was the beginning. As the university invested in plantations in the South and Caribbean, its endowment kept growing, and its investors reinforced their status as part of a global ruling class. In the 19th century, a land grant statute called the Morrill Act gave 180,000 acres of land to Yale, violently forcing off the indigenous peoples who called that land home, primarily the Ojibwe and Odawa nations. When Connecticut sold that land in 1863, Yale sued and won the modern day equivalent of $2.8 million, which went into the endowment's principal and remains there today. These were not considered crimes. Yale's system of exploiting Black and brown lives for profit never ended. It only became more lucrative with time as it adapted to the world of late-stage capitalism. In the 20th century, Yale's lead investment officer, David Swensen, and his colleagues developed the endowment model, which involved shifting the university's investments from traditional stocks and bonds into high-risk, high-yield ventures. Yale began investing hundreds of millions of dollars in exploitative industries, such as fossil fuel corporations, private prisons, predatory lending, and hedge funds that hold Puerto Rican debt and extract that debt from what is treated as the world's oldest colony. There is a layer of separation between the university and the harm being done. That layer typically comes in the form of a shell company or a private equity firm that controls Yale's assets for them. And this is another iteration of how Yale distanced itself from the genocide and forced migration of indigenous peoples that allowed its endowment to profit off of stolen land. So too will it seek to distance itself from neo-colonial violence in Puerto Rico, how the extraction of debt has led to closing schools, struggling hospitals, a higher death toll from Hurricane Maria, which itself was made more severe by the carbon emissions of fossil fuel companies. When the university profits off of forced labor in private prisons, an adaptation of the same carceral system that targeted emancipated Black people in the 19th century, Yale then uses that profit to contribute to incarceration at home by funding its private police force. These are not considered crimes. So today, all of this legally sanctioned violence done by Yale has allowed it to amass an endowment of about $30.3 billion. That wealth is no secret, but Swensen's endowment model has a policy of intergenerational neutrality, which means that the benefits of the endowment are supposed to remain the same for past, present, and future generations, accounting for inflation over time. You can even find this policy on Yale's website, and that's what the picture is here on this slide. The first time I read about intergenerational neutrality, I was unsure what to make of the concept. We know that the endowment has grown far beyond its original portfolio. According to Swensen's own writing, the adjusted value of the endowment plus inflated donations should be about $11 to $12 billion. This is supported by Yale's target spending rate, which is 5.25% of the endowment annually. That's the difference of Yale's investment returns, 8.25%, minus a high estimate of inflation, 3%. If Yale actually made 8.25% of the endowment each year and spent 5.25%, its endowment would remain the same over time, adjusting for inflation. So what gives? The truth is that there is a way out of preserving intergenerational neutrality. The way out is to follow the spending rule and simply accumulate all the extra revenue, so that surplus is not getting used now or in any other generation. The wealth just remains in the endowment so Yale can invest more of it and get exponentially wealthier in an unending cycle of profit. This is known as endowment hoarding, and it is not the practice of a nonprofit institution. Over the last 2 decades, Yale's annual returns have averaged out to 11.5%, and its average spending rate was 4.5%, so Yale is profiting much more than expected and still spending less than the investors planned. There's a common defense of the Yale endowment that goes like, okay, we know that this wealth was unjustly acquired, we know Yale has lots of it, but isn't it a good thing that they're using that wealth on medical research that saves lives, or financial aid for students, or employing more New Haven residents? And that all sounds reasonable until you learn that Yale is actually spending less than their target spending rate, or that Yale pays its fund managers the equivalent of the entire city budget of New Haven. What does it mean for a university to deliberately underestimate its returns, accumulate its wealth, and still claim the benefits of a nonprofit institution, like an exemption on paying taxes to the city it calls home? Through the years, administrators have assured us that this isn't wealth hoarding, it's just saving up for a rainy day. But that sentiment is being put to the test right now. As New Haven's communities navigate a pandemic, Yale has turned away, evoking notions of austerity. We have campaigned for COVID-19 relief measures, like canceling rent on Yale-owned properties. And last spring, Yale's property managers ended up canceling rent for the retail businesses downtown, but not for the 500 residential units they own. We have seen their priorities laid bare. Yale is willing to bail out the Patagonia, but it won't provide people with housing security in the pandemic. This fall, we hope to see Yale extend COVID-19 testing to everyone who needs it, though we were recently told at a town hall that this was out of the question. And lest you think Yale is suffering economically from the effects of the pandemic, know that they have increased their holdings in Zoom nearly 6-fold this past spring, along with similarly gainful investments in Amazon and, yes, in Slack. So we know that Yale has the practical means to redistribute its wealth. And with about $3.3 billion ready to be liquidated into cash this year, it could happen now. But wealth redistribution is a big and complex goal. We need somewhere to start. Why not start at the source of how Yale protects its wealth, the Yale Police Department? Just like Swenson's endowment model, the militarized campus police force originated at Yale. And it's because of the endowment that Yale has been able to fund its police and give them jurisdiction over the whole city, the technology to surveil Black communities, the weapons to do violence with impunity to Black community members. At our last teach-in, we drew a distinction between safety, which is about protecting people, and security, which is about protecting capital. And the YPD is there for security's sake. In fact, most of the emergency calls that Yale cops respond to are property crimes, acts that threaten the wealth of university affiliates. As for safety, resources for real emergency support are not adequately funded. Yale has a 24-hour hotline for sexual assault, but after work hours, it is staffed by administrative assistants, not trained social workers. They are stretched enough for capacity that they have told students they cannot serve them unless they call back 3 times to demonstrate that they are in crisis. And the police reforms proposed by 21CP Solutions, a consulting firm Yale hired, involve sending armed officers along with trained professionals to respond to a mental health crisis. Yale's pouring its funding for emergency response into the YPD. So we are witnessing a cycle in which Yale's money, accumulated through exploitation, makes the YPD stronger, and the YPD protects that money. That right there is an industrial complex. And we began this journey with a reflection on how to define crime. So let's consider these crimes that Yale cops can respond to with guns. Trespassing on Yale property, vandalizing a building, sleeping on a park bench, even calls that might involve harm, like robbery, are a direct result of poverty and the wealth gap in New Haven that Yale is in a position to repair. How do these crimes hold up against our knowledge of what Yale has done, of how it amassed enough wealth to fund a police department in the first place? How do these crimes hold up against the endowment's roots in the enslavement trade and genocide against Native peoples, against its modern-day investments in racist and neo-colonial industries? How its profit is tied to collapsing healthcare in Puerto Rico and forced labor in prisons? What do you think is the crime here? Let's take another pause to reflect, and before we do, I'll give you an estimate of the YPD's budget. In 2008, their budget was $10.3 million, and they haven't published it since then. But if we adjust that 2008 number for inflation, it would amount to about $12.3 million today. That money comes from harm, but it holds so much possibility for reinvestment. So as you reflect on what we're learning together, feel free to use the chat to share your thoughts on crime and criminalization, or if you're in a more hopeful state of mind, share something good that you think we could do with the YPD's budget. And if you're feeling hopeful, then you're in luck, because that's the direction that we're heading in. Funding schools. Fund community responses to people in distress, affordable housing, mental health care for all, youth employment programs, hiring more New Haveners. Thank you, these are all beautiful. Now, if you've protested in the last couple months, you might have found yourself chanting "money for schools, not police" alongside your fellow marchers. On July 4th, these words echoed through the streets of New Haven with variations like "money for housing" and "money for health," and they showed a strong awareness among the people that abolition is constructive. The prison and police abolitionist movements and their guiding activists and thinkers like Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Angela Davis have always called for strengthening systems of community care that prevent harm from occurring, or that address harm with restorative justice. When protesters take to the streets and pressure their elected officials to move government money toward true safety and well-being, what we're seeing is a demand to participate in budgeting. And there is a way to make this demand a reality. Fittingly, it's called participatory budgeting. Next slide. So I'm still pretty new to the concept of participatory budgeting, or PB, but I'm quite in love with it already, and the knowledge that I'm about to present to you comes from the brilliant work of my collaborators and the decades of organizing that have come before us. I want to give a loving shout out to the people who contributed this knowledge, especially Isaac Yearwood, Addie Kim, Josie Engel, Alex Kolokotronis, and Joy Wong. What we are introducing is not a policy proposal, at least not yet, but an exploration of how participatory budgeting could work to ensure that when we abolish the YPD, its money goes toward justice. PB is a process in which people living in a community have real decision-making power over government spending. Constituents can discuss how to allocate funds, brainstorm new projects, meet with experts to develop proposals, and reach a collective decision through voting or consensus. PB has been successfully implemented in over 7,000 cities around the world, and when it is made accessible to the people most affected by the systems of inequity we seek to change, then this process works. Participatory budgeting comes from Porto Alegre, Brazil. Next slide. In 1989, a labor movement elected the Workers' Party into office, and citizens celebrated the implementation of a people's budget. Every year, the PB process began with a citywide festival with music, dancing, and art, quite unlike the city hall meetings we may be accustomed to in the US. Instead of the mayor hosting discussions, residents of each neighborhood held meetings in their own communities, and elected officials attended. Once PB had been in place for a few years, people could use this forum to hold politicians accountable if projects had stalled. In just 8 years, PB distributed resources more equitably throughout Porto Alegre. Education and health budgets increased from about 13% to 40%. The number of schools quadrupled, and access to city water rose from 75% to 98% of the population. And the system continually became more democratic. Between 1990 and 1999, citywide participation increased from about 1,000 people to 40,000. PB in Porto Alegre faded as right-wing opposition took over in the 2000s. But this system and its success sparked inspiration for a global movement to revolutionize city budgets. In the US, neighborhoods in Chicago and New York were the first to adopt PB, which was a new term but not a new demand. PB aligned with a platform that Black power and civil rights activists had promoted decades ago for community control over local governance. Now it's a core demand of the movement for Black lives, participatory budgeting at the local, state, and federal level. Since 2012, 30 city councils in New York have implemented PB and allocated $210 million total toward education, transportation, arts, and projects New Yorkers design. PB is in New England cities too. Hartford's participatory budgeting project allows everyone ages 13 and up to develop and vote on proposals. And a similar program exists in Cambridge for residents ages 12 and up. And we have seen PB here in New Haven in smaller scale efforts by community management teams to put a few $1,000s up for a vote. That's why we have some new radar speed signs to calm traffic, and why they're painting a mural on State Street. Those two efforts took place in the Worcester Square neighborhood, where the money and resources are already available. An equitable citywide PB process would allocate more money to the 7 designated neighborhoods of need: Fairhaven, The Hill, West River, Dwight, Dixwell, New Hallville, and West Rock. The same neighborhoods where organizers like New Haven Rising had thought to change the map. The same neighborhoods that are now most affected by COVID-19. We are making the case for redistributing the Yale Police Department's money into participatory budgeting because this is part of how abolition could play out in our community. In the last 2 months alone, as the uprisings for Black lives bring us closer to revolution, we have entered a moment where demands like PB no longer seem dull and bureaucratic, but part of a radical divest-reinvest strategy. To people who say that defunding the police will jeopardize the safety of our communities, we say why not listen to the communities most directly affected by police presence and let the people decide where the money needs to go. Imagine a city where instead of calling the police, there exists a wide range of well-funded resources to turn to in crisis. Differential response systems like food and housing intervention, immediate childcare, sexual assault and domestic violence response, substance and addiction treatment, these are all more effective because they're specialized, based in de-escalation, and promote long-term recovery. And with enough funding, they could serve everyone. And it goes beyond response. If the YPD's millions of dollars go toward giving more folks access to food, shelter, and jobs, we can begin to repair the conditions that create poverty and crime, and the police would no longer be able to claim they are needed. That's why we hope to build a campaign that works in tandem with the movement to defund the NHPD and to build a more just city. Defund YPD, Reinvest in PB is a continuation of movements to redistribute wealth, like New Haven Rising's fight for a jobs agreement, movements that will continue to inspire and inform what we do. But Defund YPD, Reinvest in PB is also a start toward abolition and a world where we are all safe. That's all I got for you. Thank you.